This is Brian, SpringFiles.com in review. And what I'm looking at today is 2005's Man-Thing, directed by Leonard. And to talk about this movie, I need to go a little bit into the time period to better establish it. In 1998, New Line Pictures released Blade, starring Wesley Snipes. And unlike what some people want you to believe, this was the movie that proved superhero movies were viable, not the X-Men, which, if I recall, came a year later. As I said, what Blade did was prove that these movies could make money. What the X-Men did was prove that it wasn't a one-off. And that's important. But still, Blade deserves the credit as the beginning of what came to be the superhero era, if you will. Now, this was also during a time where Marvel Studios didn't exist, and they had licensed their IP, intellectual property, to various other studios. So New Line had Blade, Fox had the X-Men, and Lionsgate had Man-Thing. Though Lionsgate also got the publisher when they purchased Artisan Pictures in 2003. But at this point in time, they had Man-Thing. And if you've read the comics about the Man-Thing, he's not a superhero. In some ways, he's comparable to Ghost Rider in the sense that he is literally a force of nature. He is not what one would typically think of as a superhero. And he would be very hard to pull off in that time, though they did try. And this movie has been panned by most people as far as I'm aware. And that's a pity, because it's not a terrible movie. It's not great, don't get me wrong, but it's not a terrible movie. The greatest problem that I can see with Man-Thing is that it had no budget to speak of. Well, I should say it had relatively little money to produce. And when you're dealing with a creature that's essentially a muck monster, that's a bit of a problem. Leonard, who directed movies like The Lawnmower Man and Virtuosity, among others, does fairly well with what he has. Though, as I said, Man-Thing is not a traditional hero. So, at the best of times, it would be a hard character to deal with. And the way that Leonard and the writers of the movie chose to handle it is actually not bad. They treat the Man-Thing almost as if he were Jaws, which is to say, after what we see in the beginning is essentially the Man-Thing being born, we see something, I should say, enacting vengeance on the oil baron's henchmen and whomever else ventures into the swamp. And in fact, you don't see the Man-Thing really until the last, I want to say, half hour, give or take, of the movie. And he looks okay. Doesn't look bad. Doesn't look great. But conversely, it doesn't look like a dude in a suit. It's also not quite Man-Thing-ish enough for my liking, but it's not bad either. Though the movie moves on and we come to learn that a new sheriff, is coming to this town, which is supposed to be in Louisiana, I assume, but is actually in Australia. And this is an interesting point, because I don't understand why this movie was shot in Australia. It might have been cheaper to do, but you can't tell me that there weren't production studios in Louisiana. And while it may have been cheaper to shoot in Australia, I get the feeling it's not that much cheaper. So I consider that decision a really odd one. But in any case, this new sheriff comes to town and he begins to investigate these mysterious, particularly violent deaths that have been happening around the swamp. This sheriff looks like a doppelganger for Michael Shanks, the actor who played in the Stargate movies. And while I don't want to call him a cheaper, as in cost to hire, Michael Shanks, the fact that he just looks so much like him makes me wonder if the producers of this movie really wanted Michael Shanks and couldn't get him. In any case, the new sheriff comes and starts digging into these murders. There's this villainous oil baron, and he is desecrating the swamp with his oil rigs and such, and there's an environmental movement, and there's also a very attractive woman who likes the sheriff, but of course they can't admit to that initially. In fact, they kind of despise each other at first, but it goes without saying they're going to come to really dig each other. The movie goes into a wee bit of Native American mysticism, and there's a character who appears to be Native American or Creole, perhaps, and he's very ominous and stuff. It's kind of cliche, to be totally honest. The bad thing, as I said, is okay, but the human actors are passable. The actor who played the sheriff, the Michael Shanks lookalike, is okay. The lady who plays the environmentalist is okay. They're not exactly given a lot to work with, and I'm guessing they're doing the best with what they had, but the performances aren't anything to write home about, and this is the heart of the problem. If you recall, Joe, it has actors like Richard Dreyfuss, Roy Schneider, the guy who played Quint, his name is eluding me right now, but you had a very high caliber of actors, and they really helped carry the movie when the shark wasn't doing shark things, or wasn't present, which it wasn't through most of that movie. That works in that context, though you can't have an antagonist that doesn't appear to the last third of the movie, and actors who aren't good enough to carry it till that happens. And unfortunately, that's the case with this movie. It's very cartoony, and I know the subject matter is a comic book, but if you've read Man-Thing, and I don't mean when he crosses over, he's like with Spider-Man or some such thing, but if you've read the Man-Thing comic, it is surprisingly profound, is perhaps a little strong. It's surprisingly deep in the way it connects this creature who was once a man, Ted Sallis, and how he became the Man-Thing and his purpose. It's done very well in the comic, and it's not done particularly well here. Speaking of Ted Sallis, the movie talks about him, how he vanished, and it is suspected that foul play is behind it. But it's not his story. It's also not the Man-Thing story. The movie is essentially the story of this sheriff coming to this town in Louisiana and having to deal with all sorts of weird and bizarre occurrences. That's the movie. And that's the pity. Though, once again, it's not a bad movie, and it's certainly watchable. Though, if you're at all familiar with the Man-Thing, you're going to be disappointed. But I think it's still worth watching. It's very well shot, and as I mentioned, it's shot in Australia. And the scenes where you have swamps, it's probably done in a studio. It's lit very green, and while I don't think it's a real swamp, it's interesting. And the whole movie, in fact, has a very nice color palette. It's well shot, and it's worth seeing, especially if you're a completist like I am. Though I wouldn't rush to add it to my collection by any stretch of the imagination, it is still a decent movie. So what do you think? This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.